This happened 4 years ago. It was the middle of winter, and the night was unseasonably warm, without a hint of snow on the ground. I left my apartment around 8 p.m. to go for my daily walk. I work nights and my schedule was all messed up, hence the 8 p.m. walk. I planned to cross the bridge into the nearby city. For further context, I'm a tall guy, fairly athletic, and I was in my late 20s at the time. I'd rarely had problems walking at night and generally felt safe doing so. I put on my headphones and headed towards the bridge. The first 20 minutes were uneventful. I passed by old houses, a subpar Mexican restaurant, a really good Mexican restaurant, a sketchy gas station, some newly built upscale apartments, and finally arrived at the river. I paused to enjoy the view of the bright city lights reflecting over the dark, flowing water that had yet to freeze. I crossed the bridge into the city and stopped at a four-way intersection, hitting the crosswalk button. That's when I noticed someone standing on the opposite corner, the only other person I'd seen outside that night. She didn't seem to be waiting for the light to change, so I assumed she was waiting for an Uber. The street, usually bustling during the daytime, was silent. The light changed, and I crossed in her direction. As I got closer, I noticed she kept casting glances in my direction, quickly looking away afterward, almost sheepishly. She did this multiple times. I figured I must have made her uneasy. After all, we were the only two people on a dimly lit street. As I passed by, I noticed her outfit, mostly because I thought she looked cold. A knitted hat with tassels, a sweater that seemed too thin for the winter, tight jeans, and a little plastic children's backpack. At first I thought she was a teenager, but on closer inspection she seemed to be in her late 20s or 30s. She had short, cropped, light brown hair, a pale complexion, and a thin build. She was of average height, though I was maybe a head taller than her. I continued walking down the street. I passed high-rise hotels on my right and left, and made my way into a central park. During peak hours, this area would be packed with tourists and locals alike. But at this odd hour, with the pandemic in full swing, I felt like the only man in the city. I admired the brilliant display of lighted trees as I crossed through the center of the park. Reaching what I thought was the halfway point of my walk, I decided to loop around an old marble and stone library and head back towards the bridge. As I turned the corner of the library and stepped back onto the street, I nearly collided with someone walking towards me. It was the same woman I'd seen just 10 minutes earlier. I still had my noise-canceling headphones on, so I pulled one side down and said something to apologize. She didn't respond. Instead, she stepped back and stood under a streetlight, avoiding eye contact. She cast tiny glances in my direction, the same nervous tick I'd noticed earlier. I nodded a polite goodnight, put my headphones back on, and headed toward the nearest crosswalk. Logic told me she must be walking in the direction I had just come from, since we'd almost run into each other. But something in my gut told me otherwise. Sure enough, when I glanced back, I saw her trailing close behind me, her strides long and energetic. I found this odd enough that I continued to watch her out of the corner of my eye. When I reached the crosswalk and stood waiting for the light to change, she caught up with me, passed by, and stopped a few meters ahead. She squatted down next to a plastic bag and began rifling through it frantically, occasionally glancing up at me. Something about her movement struck me as off. It didn't seem like she was genuinely looking for something. Her motions seemed careless and exaggerated, almost like bad acting. The way she kept looking at me felt wrong, unnerving. The light changed and I began to walk quickly, but she was faster. She stood abruptly, darted past me towards the museum, and swung her half-open little pink backpack over her shoulder. Her silhouette disappeared into the darkness beyond the streetlights. Relieved, I let my guard down and restarted my podcast. Beyond the museum was a poorly lit stretch of sidewalk in front of a squat building with mirror-like windows. As I made my way towards the bridge, I glanced at the building's windows and froze. In the reflection, I saw a dark figure sprinting silently toward me, dreamlike. Out of sheer confusion, I turned to face her. She stopped mere feet away, staring at me with wide, frantic eyes. Her gaze flicked between my arms and face as though sizing me up. I must have looked more prepared to fight than I felt because my sudden turn seemed to catch her off guard. She gripped something small tightly in one hand, holding it off to the side where I couldn't see it clearly in the shadows. Time seemed to stretch as we stood there, locked in a tense standoff. I waited, paralyzed by fear, for her to make a move. Then, to my enormous relief, a car trundled slowly by. Bolstered by its presence, I shouted over my blaring podcast, "What do you want?" She didn't respond. Instead, she continued to stare, her expression unreadable. Slowly, I began backing away, one step at a time, until I felt confident enough to turn and walk briskly towards a better-lit area. I kept glancing back. She stood there for a while, unmoving, before abruptly turning away and crossing the street without looking for traffic. She disappeared around the corner of a building. Her casual departure unsettled me even more. I kept checking over my shoulder as I walked home. The bridge was well lit, and I saw no sign of her. Since the bridge was the only reasonable way for her to follow me, I breathed a sigh of relief. The streets were eerily quiet, no cars, no pedestrians. Nothing happened after that. I didn't call the cops that night, and to this day, I regret it. My roommates insisted that I report the incident, but I couldn't figure out what to say. I hadn't been attacked, and I doubted they would find her anyway. I made excuses. Looking back, I realize I must have been in shock, in denial about how close I had come to being ambushed by someone smaller than me, in my own city, just minutes from my apartment. One of my roommates called the cops on my behalf. A patrol car drove through the area, but by then she was long gone. It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always fascinated by military gear, had received a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday and had left them at my apartment. One night, bored and curious, I decided to try out the goggles at a wooded hiking area and nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this was a foolish idea, especially since I was alone and a young woman. But I was excited about the possibility of seeing deer and other nocturnal wildlife in their natural habitat. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before without encountering anyone else. Our area is mostly rural and generally safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the small, sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign that read, "Park closes at 10, and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, providing the only light filtering through the tree canopy. It was quite dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I'd found a place to sit, so I lit my way with the mini mag light attached to my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard rustling in the distance, but it seemed ordinary enough. Probably animals, maybe the deer I'd come hoping to see. After hiking a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. If you've ever used night vision goggles, you'll know how impressive the effect is. They transform near-pitch darkness into a scene as bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but the clarity is remarkable. For a while, I enjoyed myself, scanning the surroundings from my fallen log perch. I saw some chipmunks playing in the leaves and a large owl blinking its luminous eyes at me from a tree branch. But no deer. It occurred to me that I might be too exposed sitting out in the open, so I decided to find a more concealed spot. I ventured deeper into the woods and came upon a massive tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was easy to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for the deer. But I didn't see any deer. What I did see, illuminated in bright night vision green after about 10 minutes, chilled me to the core. A man, dressed head to toe in dark clothing, moving stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the direction I had entered, clearly trying to stay hidden. He moved methodically, darting from tree to tree and carefully scanning the area before advancing again. He looked like he was searching for someone. It took me a moment to notice he was carrying something. When I realized what it was, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. He held a large knife in his hand, gripping it like he was ready to use it. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve where hunting of any kind was prohibited. Besides, the man was alone, dressed unlike any hunter, and there were no deer in sight. Most importantly, hunters don't usually take down their prey with knives. Suddenly, I became acutely aware of my situation. A young woman, alone, unarmed, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, no cell phone. Even if I'd had one, I wouldn't have dared use it, fearing the glow of the screen or sound of my voice would draw his attention. I didn't understand how he could see so well in the dark. Perhaps his eyes had adjusted, but I was terrified he would look up and spot me. I sat frozen, barely daring to breathe, as I watched him continue his slow, deliberate search. He seemed to be stalking someone. The sickening thought struck me. Was he looking for me? I thought back to the rustling sounds I'd heard earlier when I first entered the woods, and a more horrifying memory surfaced. A white car that had followed me too closely for much of my drive to the nature preserve. At the time, I'd been annoyed and a little uneasy, but I'd shrugged it off when the car passed me as I turned into the parking area. Now I wondered, was this the driver of that car? Had he circled back, seen my vehicle alone in the lot, and decided to follow me in? I sat paralyzed in the tree for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to half an hour. At one point, he paused directly beneath my tree, and I was sure he was going to look up and find me. My heart felt like it would explode, but he didn't. Eventually, I heard him mutter, "Fuck it," and he turned back in the direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, drenched in sweat and quietly crying, until the sun began to rise hours later. Only then did I climb down, gripping the small can of pepper spray on my keychain, and make my way as quickly as I could to the parking lot. When I reached my car, my terror was reignited. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and deep scratches ran down the sides of the car, presumably made by the same large knife I'd seen him carrying. The damage made it painfully clear how lucky I was. If not for the night vision goggles that allowed me to spot him before he could spot me, and the sturdy branches of that tree, I don't think I would have made it out of those woods alive. I live on a lake, and across from it are woods. In my small neighborhood, we own about 17 acres of land. Our neighbor's house sits on a slight hill, and 2 fences separate our stretch of land from the neighboring properties. Beyond those fences live our other neighbors. I live in a trailer. It has a front door that leads into the living room and kitchen, and a back door at the end of the hallway. From the kitchen windows, you can see the garage. Heading down the hall to the back door takes you away from the common areas of the home. One night, my friend stayed over. We spent the evening sitting on the dock, spinning ourselves dizzy on my old swing, and then lying under the stars in my neighbor's yard. Their property starts just 10 feet away from my back porch and extends all the way down to the lake. It's an expansive, football field-sized stretch of land. At some point, I walked inside for something while my friend, let's call her Toriel, one of my favorite characters, stayed outside, chatting with her boyfriend, whom we'll call Keely. He was in New Mexico with a group from our college. When Toriel came back inside, she went about her business as usual, but then she looked at me strangely and asked, "Hey, did you hear anything tonight?" I gave her a puzzled look but replied that I hadn't. Then she explained that, while she was on the phone with Keely, she heard something near our garage or right beside it. The garage doors were open at the time. She described it as a growling sound, deep, vicious, and almost bloodthirsty. It didn't sound like any dog she'd ever heard. Our back porch light doesn't illuminate the garage or the area beyond it, so she couldn't see anything. We chalked it up to her imagination or maybe one of my dad's tools making noise, combined with the usual night sounds of crickets and other bugs. That was a couple of weeks ago. A few days ago, however, something happened that I cannot explain. At around 3 a.m., my puppy woke me up to take her outside. Half asleep, I carried her out so she could do her business. As I stood there, I heard it, the same growling Toriel had described. At first I thought I was imagining it, but then it came again, longer this time and more menacing. It sounded like a warning. Gripping a branch-like club I used to guide the puppy, I scanned the darkness. To clarify, I would never beat my dog or intentionally harm her. I only use light discipline when necessary, like a spank with my hand if she doesn't listen. As I stood there, I noticed a pair of eyes staring back at me, reflecting the faint porch light. The silhouette of something large lingered just out of the light's reach. I froze, staring at the eyes, and it stared back. We never broke eye contact. Slowly, I crept down the steps, picked up my puppy Ayasha, and backed into the house. I never turned my back on it. Once inside, I locked the door and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Our outdoor dog slept inside that night too. If that weren't unsettling enough, there's more. We had a fox, let's call him Todd, who frequently wandered our neighborhood and the surrounding properties. Todd had never caused any harm. Our outdoor dog would chase him off occasionally, but he mostly kept to himself. The night after the encounter with the eyes, I heard Todd calling. His cries were close, likely from our driveway or just beside it. I stepped out to listen, calling back to him. At first, it seemed normal. Then, Todd's calls grew frantic, ear-piercing shrieks of warning. And then I heard that growl again, the same chilling growl that had unsettled me days before. The sound of a scuffle followed, a dog-like creature lunging in a fight. Todd's frantic cries abruptly ended with a yelp, and then there was silence. Panicked, I saw my neighbor step outside. I yelled for her to get back in her house. Out of the corner of my eye, just beyond her porch light's reach, I saw the silhouette again. It was large, holding something smaller in its mouth. I stood on my porch, struggling to hold back my 90-pound pit bull mix as she strained to go after it. Ayasha pawed at the door, wanting to join the commotion, but Todd was gone. He didn't call back. He was silent. Todd was dead. I still don't know what the creature was. Maybe a coyote. They're known to live across the lake. But this felt different. There's something deeply unsettling about how it all unfolded. The scariest part is that I work second shifts and come home at night. The distance from our driveway to the front porch is long and dark, far too isolated to feel safe with something lurking nearby. Something that sounds like a demon and killed a fox for no apparent reason. This story happened to me back when I was still living at my parents' house. I was commuting to college at the time and had 3 siblings living at home as well, my brother and 2 sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio, surrounded by woods and farm fields on both sides. During the week, my dad usually left for work at 2 a.m., so I always felt like it was my responsibility to be the man of the house during the hours when something sketchy might happen. However, because it was the weekend, my dad was home that night. I woke up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to get my attention. We had separate rooms upstairs, and from the upstairs hallway, you could look down over the banister and see the front door. It took me a moment to shake off the haze of sleep and register what was happening. I glanced at the clock. It was around 2:30 a.m. My brother told me there were 2 men at our front door. That really woke me up. We quietly stepped out of my room and peeked over the banister to look at the front door. However, there was no one there. I noticed my parents standing off to the side, out of view from the glass in the front door. I whispered down to my dad, and he told me there had been 2 men talking to each other and knocking on the door. Hearing this from my dad made the situation feel even more serious. I went back into my room, grabbed my pistol, and carefully shuffled down the stairs after checking to make sure the men weren't at the door. If they had been, they would have easily seen me, as the stairs were in direct view of the front door. My brother followed close behind as we moved over to where my parents were standing. We whispered, trying to figure out what was going on. My parents had been woken by our dog barking and had come out to find these 2 men knocking loudly at the door. The fact that these men were here at 2:30 a.m., in a rural area where houses are spread hundreds of yards apart, and still knocking despite the barking dog, made the situation extremely unnerving. After a couple of minutes, the men walked away. We all crept across the kitchen into the family room, where we could peek out the windows toward the driveway, which was lit by our outdoor light. A black Cadillac was parked there, but from what we could see, it was empty. Naturally, our immediate question was, where did these guys go? Unfortunately, we got our answer when the handles on our back French doors started jiggling. The men were actively trying to break into the back of our house, which led directly into the kitchen. At this point, I distinctly remember my mom frantically saying, "David," to my dad, her voice full of panic. 2 things happened simultaneously. Adrenaline coursed through my body as I prepared my handgun, bracing for the horrifying possibility that I might have to shoot someone. Meanwhile, my dad calmly picked up the phone and called the police, explaining the situation. After about a minute of jiggling, the men stopped trying to force the back door and disappeared again, only to return to knocking at the front. However, by this point, several minutes had passed, and we suddenly saw local police cars flying up our driveway and front yard with their lights on. The 2 men bolted, attempting to run around the house and across the driveway. One of them ran out of our view, but the other was intercepted by an officer, who yelled at him to get on the ground. When he didn't comply, the officer tased him, and he fell to the ground. Other officers circled the house to find the second man, while one came to speak with my dad and me as we stepped outside. They eventually located the second man hiding in my sister's small playhouse in the backyard. Both men appeared to be either drunk or high, as one of them was found with cocaine in his possession. While both were arrested that night, we never found out what they were charged with or what ultimately happened to them. Needless to say, the entire experience was terrifying and far from enjoyable.